Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas that shape and protect our digital world. Today we sit down with Mike D'Ambrosio, who spent 25 plus years at U.S. Secret Service, an agency that many are not aware of the critical role that they play in investigating and combating cyber crimes. Mike provides some insights into the history, as well as how those crimes have evolved and what Secret Service is doing to stay ahead of the threat. Thrilled to be here today to talk with Mike D'Ambrosio, who many of you know has a stellar background in law enforcement, in cyber-related issues, and most importantly is a senior fellow with the McCrary Institute. Really excited about our conversation today. Every time I sit down with Mike, I learn something new. Every once in a while, I might want to kick down a door after we chat, and bottom line is brings a sense of professionalism and really thoughtful, inquisitive approaches to many of these issues. Started out in the Marine Corps, hoorah! After 5 years, went into law enforcement, and then had, how many years were you at Secret Service, Mike?
I was 25 years.
25 years at U.S. Secret Service, and moved all the way up the ranks to become the Assistant Director of Investigations, which included cyber. I think fair to say played a major role in upping Secret Service's game when it comes to cyber activities, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Before we jump into the meat and the potatoes, into some of the big issues we're grappling with today, love to ask everyone, just because I think it's everyone's unique superpower, their why. Why they pursued the jobs they did, why they pursued the missions they put forward. So why don't we start there, Mike, if that's okay?
No, absolutely. Listen, first, Frank, it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the discussion. Really feel privileged to have been asked to be a part of the McCrary Institute, just because of the reputation that you have and the things that you are doing. So really looking forward to the things that they're going to be doing and to our discussion today. Awesome. As far as the why, what I did, I would say no matter what, as a kid, I always enjoyed the cops and robbers and the military. And so one of the things that really kind of drove home for me is a patriotic sense, patriotic mission, right? And so I fulfilled it going into the Marine Corps and then joining the Secret Service, basically having a job in life that's more, it's not a job. Right. When I retired, I basically said I never worked. Up to that point, I had never worked a day in my life.
Well, thank goodness you did work for 25 years in law enforcement. So.
And so to me, it's really all about the country, how we can make things better. We live in a great place. One of the things that I'll say is I really did get to see a large portion of the world between the Marine Corps and the Secret Service, and there really is no better place than the United States, and so that's why I did what I did.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for your service. That's not just, those aren't empty words, that's reality, and thanks for all you do every day. And to be very blunt, the McCrary Institute, our hope is to be able to advance the ball and provide ammunition for those fighting the hard fights.
They're still in it today.
Yeah, exactly. So along those lines with the why, when did you realize cyber really matters? And I don't mean to be pejorative toward law enforcement, but normally when you look at the military and the intelligence community, they're pretty far along when it comes to cyber-related activities. Law enforcement still has a bit of a learning curve, I think.
It does, but what I would say is this. I think my realization when it came to cyber was probably about halfway through my career, right? But what I would say is this, a lot of guys were focused on the technology, right? And specifically more the bits and the bytes of cyber crimes, right? What I started looking at is everything we do at this point involves some sort of technology, right? And I looked at it and I said, really, cyber is just a place. It's a domain. And if we're going to investigate, we have to be able to investigate within that domain in order to catch the bad guys and the adversaries that were in there. And so it was really more as society moved and as technology became more within our life, just more perverse within our life, I wanted to make sure, or at least what I would say is, I needed to understand how to fight crime within that.
So in essence, behind the clickety-clack of the keyboard is a person, right? So, and in military, I mean, not to jump over you, but I don't think any form of conflict today and tomorrow will not have a cyber dimension. You can say the exact same thing about crime, right?
100%. I actually think the military was first there. They realized that it was a domain. I think today when you start looking at crime, a lot of the crimes are not much different than they were before technology occurred. Technology has enabled them. Technology has made them be able to do it at speed, right? There maybe have been some adjustments, right? But we talk a lot about business email compromise, right? That was going on before the internet, right? People were doing it by mail, right? And defrauding people. And so today, all that's occurred is that we've taken the crimes that we have done historically, and we are now committing them at scale within the cyber domain.
And the good guys. So, I mean, technology changes, human nature remains consistent.
That's right.
How do we empower and enable the good guys to scale their activities as well?
Listen, it's a much harder question, right? Or at least harder to accomplish, because I think inevitably the good guys move at a slower speed to adapt. It's just the way large organizations move. I think some of the things that we have to do is getting right how we view cybercrime, and how it's really much more collaborative as opposed to previous crimes or previous times. I think is really important. And so one of the things that I'll say is, I kind of look at my career in law enforcement where it changed because of 9/11, right? And so prior to 9/11, law enforcement was very siloed. We each had our own jurisdictions that we investigated. When they overlapped, we would work together for a period of time, and then we would go back doing our own thing. Obviously, 9/11 occurs, and people realized that the bad guys had exploited seams within the gaps between law enforcement, intelligence, and national security, and we started bringing things together. I think the same approach applies with cybercrime, where these criminals are operating much more broad, from outside the boundaries of the U.S. We need a much more collaborative approach between U.S. law enforcement as well as international law enforcement.
And to pull that thread a little further, so your time at Secret Service, and you've moved up the ranks in various roles. When you became assistant, so my time with the service around cyber goes back to the Electronic Crimes Task Force, and working with some of the luminaries like Bob Razor, Bob Weaver, so many others, all the way back to Stu Knight, who kind of pulled me into recognizing the importance of Secret Service. But can you sort of give us, I'm not sure our listeners have a full appreciation for the mission that Secret Service is involved in when it comes to countering cybercrime, and also some of the history. So we often forget sort of our legacy, and I think that's so critical in understanding how we can get ahead of the game.
So first, I would say if I go to most people and I ask them, what does the Secret Service do? They're going to reference our protective mission, right? Secret Service actually was not created, to protect the president. Secret Service was created to protect the critical financial infrastructure right after the Civil War, right? And so because of all the counterfeiting that was occurring. So Secret Service was actually one of the first law enforcement agencies within the United States focusing on counterfeiting. As those types of crimes expanded, we get into with banks and financial institutions, they expanded digital payments. Obviously, the first in the 80s was credit cards, and we sort of expanded into that particular platform, right? Bob Weaver in 1995 basically came up with the idea of the Electronic Crimes Task Force, and it was a realization that in order to start to address the crimes of that were coming, he needed a private-public partnership, and it was really one of the first private-public partnerships, And so there was only one electronic
crime. And it was a legit one.
It was legit,
Yep.
right? And I don't know if you remember, but in those days, there was a lot of cell phones and the cell phone cloning. That's what the Electronic Crimes Task Force was really focused on.
They had their little museum, building Tower 7, right, of the
Yes.
World Trade Center.
That's correct.
And unfortunately...
that's the first building that went down.
And the
right?
artifacts, yeah.
And the effects.
And
but I will say the Electronic Crimes Task Force, because of the partnerships that it had within the private sector, they actually became instrumental in identifying through cell phones and through linking the telephone calls on prepaid cards and those types of things, right, the path of some of the hijackers within 9/11. As far as that became then congressionally mandated the expansion of what was known then as the Electronic Crimes Task Force. And the Secret Service expanded that across the board to all of the field offices.
Oh,
right?
wow. All the field offices.
All the field
had
offices
an ECTF.
had an ECTF. Right? We also then, because going back to our roots, Secret Service, as it's pursuing, has two sort of task forces, electronic crimes and financial crimes. The FBI is really focused on terrorism in those days. What really starts to happen is, as the digitization of the payment system, Secret Service is very close with the financial institutions. And so that really propels us within these sort of financial malware breach types of investigations going forward. The FBI, after sort of getting out of some of the Middle East wars and the focus, starts to decide that, again, everything is being committed because within a cyber domain, that's where all the evidence is, and they start proceeding in that lane as well as the Secret Service.
Awesome. And when you were AD, did you merge the fraud task forces with the electronic crimes task forces?
So within my career, prior to becoming the assistant director, I did a position for about 2 years as the special agent in charge of the criminal investigative division. Okay. And one of the things that we wanted to pursue was there really started to be a convergence between electronic crime investigations, right, which is more the malware, the breaches, those types of investigations, and our financial crime investigations. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, the breach was an effort to steal the data for financial crimes, right? And so we decided that we would be more effective by combining the two. And now we have the cyber-enabled task forces, right? And it really is just a realization and a focus for the service that says what we do, what everybody does, cyber is a part of every investigation, but what we do is going back to our roots, is financial investigations, and today's investigations are complex cyber-enabled fraud investigations.
And when you think about it, it's really about the integrity of our system. So even if there were not a successful attack, if there were a fear in our financial services and it could have a run on the economy, right?
It can. So I don't know if you know, going back to Counterfeit, where I started my career is investigating counterfeit currency, right? You would find instances where there was enough counterfeit in a certain geographic area, so in Queens, right, or in Jackson Heights, in which people would not accept $100 bills. Right? Yeah. And so even overseas, we would have periods where there was so much counterfeit in a small concentrated area that people would stop accepting U.S. currency. And so to your point, right, you can only extrapolate that to see how that would be the case if it was a bigger problem.
I do want to pull the thread on the super notes and the super bills in a second, but Queens. So if I'm not mistaken, where'd you grow up, Mike?
I grew up out in Long Island, Patchogue.
Yeah. And unfortunately, you're a Rangers fan, right?
Actually, I grew up as an Islanders fan, but since I moved to
you were a fair weather fan. We win 4 cups, and then you abort ship. Okay, all good. In all sincerity, Queens is home too. So spent a lot of time at Shea Stadium and grew up in Long Island. But want to pull the thread on the counterfeit currency. And one threat actor that rises to the top of the list, I think, is North Korea.
Yes.
And for years, they were printing these so-called super bill, super notes that were pretty darn good. And if I'm not mistaken, we had to spend a whole lot of money to try to update and modernize our printing to curtail some of that activity. But in a weird way, you can see that exact thread play out in cyber. And I mean, you look at most countries, criminal organizations try to penetrate legal systems, judiciary, law enforcement, whatever it may be. In North Korea's case, it's the opposite. It's the state trying to penetrate organized crime, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. Listen, what we saw with the supernote, and
if you can define the supernote.
Sure. So the supernote was called exactly that because it was so close to the genuine note, right, that it was very hard, extremely hard to tell that it was counterfeit, and you couldn't tell unless you knew the specific defects of the note, right? It took the service many years to figure out who was actually behind it. It circulated amongst first different terrorist factions, whether it would have been the official IRA.
Yeah, I remember there was a big case.
Big case. And so, and what it appeared to be, right, was what it turned out to be is a nation state using the counterfeiting of currency to raise, one, funding for itself, and the other to support sort of proxies. And so the case went on from, it was first discovered in 1991, right? And you know, the funny story that goes around with the supernote is it was first discovered in the Philippines, and the Philippine central bank would collect all the U.S. currency. The $100 bill came out. It was actually just several ladies that were checking the notes by hand, and said that this one doesn't feel right. Sent it to the Secret Service. Secret Service sent it back, said, no, it's genuine. She sent it back to the service again and said, no, it's not. And the service did a secondary look and really had to do an examination to determine that it was counterfeit. And that launched this really 20-year investigation. But I think what was important about that, at least for me, right, is I really learned the importance of sort of how to approach a case, a criminal investigation involving nation state, terrorists, and transnational organized crime. Right. One of the things that the North Koreans couldn't do is they couldn't go just out to the street corner and sell supernotes. So they leveraged terrorist organizations who then leveraged organized crime. And I think today you see a lot of that playing out, again, within the cyber domain, whether it be Russians, whether it be further actions by North Korea, hacking the SWIFT network, hacking Bitcoin exchanges, Sony, those types of things, right? They've just sort of evolved into today where they can operate effectively and really steal money at scale.
And if you look at North Korea in a map at night, South Korea is lit up, North Korea is dark, and it's amazing. And obviously they have to also work with countries that will allow them to operate or covertly operate, and I think China plays into that as well. But looking sort of at that supernote trajectory, we are seeing largely the same thing when it comes to cyber crimes, right, with North Korea?
Yeah, they're definitely pursuing. Right, because they have no choice. They've been, you know, it sort of speaks to
how are they paying for their nuclear programs?
Right, the effectiveness of sanctions, right? And so they coin North Korea the Mafia state. And, you know, one of the things that I think that we found was that it runs very much like the Mafia. People would go out to different assignments, and they would have to fund their own sort of existence and then kick back a portion of the proceeds.
Wow.
To the regime, right? And I think today they're doing very much the same thing. They've just discovered that, you know, again, if I print counterfeit, I've got to go out and sell that on the street. For me to hack a virtual currency exchange or the SWIFT network are much more successful, and the reward is much higher.
Yeah, and the risk of getting shot or arrested is often lower.
That's right.
So.
And you know, one of the things that I will say is one of the things that I learned in some of these investigations is that with these nation states that are sort of leveraging organized criminal groups, it does expose them.
Yep.
Right? Because criminal groups are not, their tradecraft is clearly not as good.
No, that's a great point, because, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of our cyber criminals have safe haven in countries we have a hard time reaching.
That's right.
Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. This may sound a little... We took some heat for this, but there is this axis of evil that's kicking off in one way or another. But they're very different. So in Russia's case, as long as the state doesn't go after them, they can utilize their criminals. In China, maybe it's individuals moonlighting out of the PLA.
That's right.
And North Korea, obviously, very different, and others different as well. How do you think, and if you were to be joining the service today, if you were just went through and you're a young recruit, what would you think that job would entail, and what sorts of skills does the service need? And then let's talk about how we get our arms around all of this.
So believe it or not, right? I actually don't think the skills are much different. I think the configuration and how the service configures themselves by what types of roles they have should change. And so, again, when I came out of the Marine Corps and joined the Secret Service, and we were focusing on counterfeit investigations, a lot of it is running confidential informants and doing physical surveillances. Today, that's not the case, right? What it mainly is operating more, gathering evidence, right? Doing a lot more forensic type of evidence work. And so I think the service really needs to focus on expanding an analytical program with analysts that are focused in on that, right? But you still need a core group of agents that understand how to interview individuals, how cases operate, what's the mindset, right, of the criminal actor. And so a lot of those skills that you get are coming up in the pipes, learning some of those basic street crime investigations. To this day, you know, when I was sitting in the assistant director's chair, and even though the criminal investigations were somewhat different, I could always apply back and say, well, hold on a second. If we were on the street and we were doing this, this is how we would do it then. Why doesn't this apply today, right? And one of the things I found going as the assistant director is we lost a skill set from as agents, right, in speaking to people, in interviewing people, in having an inquisitive mind that's asking a lot of questions, right, in order to understand the real dynamics behind the crime. The other thing that I think is really important,
critical thinking,
critical thinking,
essential,
right, is essential.
Yep.
The other thing is understanding that 90% of most crimes are still financially motivated. Even North Korea, at the end of the day, right? Most of what they're doing is financially motivated. Now, we could talk about different actors that are sort of maybe prepping the battlefield and doing some espionage and things like that. There's no question about that, right? But most of it is still financially motivated. And so if you follow the money, at the end of the day, you're going to find a bad guy at the end of the rainbow.
Roger that, roger that. And those skills will be needed forever in the law enforcement community.
That's correct.
You know, one of the things that I have found most intriguing, rewarding, and what Secret Service does so well is they actually spend time with their state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. So there's a lot of talk about supporting SLTT, state and local, but Service actually follows up the talk with a lot of activity and action. And at the end of the day, all crimes are local. So how do we, can you shed a little bit of light on firstly, if you agree with that, and then how we can double down on that?
Yeah, so first, I absolutely agree with that, right? Especially in the areas of crime that the service is really focused on, right? So from a financial crime perspective, there's always a victim, right? And you want to focus on that victim. And even though you want to maybe elevate that crime to an organizational level and take out the organization, there are victims at the end of the day that you're focused on, right? A lot of that occurs within jurisdictions. When people are the victim of a crime, who do they call? They generally are not reaching out to their local Secret Service agent right off the bat. They're calling their local police department. And so I think having those types of relationships and embedding yourselves with state and locals is critical. For the service, that also dovetails into our protection mission, in which when we go out to these local jurisdictions, we work with them intensively. It just really builds that sort of relationship model, right?
And trust, and shared scar tissue, right?
And so one of the things really that we focus on within our task force, right, is working with the state and locals in these investigations in which we bring the victims' crimes to that jurisdiction to be prosecuted, right? Now, some of those things that develop into much larger organizational cases, right, we may elevate to a federal crime. And that benefits both the state and the local jurisdiction, as well as the Secret Service. So to me, I look at it as a collaborative relationship where we're working together, we're identifying victims in their district, we're prosecuting the perpetrators of those crimes in their district, unless we find out that there's a much larger investigation that we can turn that into and have much more substantial impact, right? And that formula has worked tremendously. But there's a second piece to that, right? Is that you have to be able to build the capacity of the state and local officer in order to contribute to that. And, you know, most crimes, you know, let's take state and locals. What are they really focused on? They're focused on those immediate, those violent crimes within their area. Those are going to be they're going to be the priorities, right? And so, generally speaking, they don't have a large skill set in order to investigate a much longer, complex, cyber-enabled fraud investigation. Where the service can come in is we can provide them that expertise. We can provide them within our task force the labs and the tools in order to do that. And what's been very successful for the Secret Service on that is the NCFI, the National Cyber Forensic Institute.
Yeah, and they've done yeoman's work, the NCFI, and I think I'm glad you brought them up. Just before I jump into the SLTT piece a little further, we've got 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act sunsetting. What do you think, in your old job, what would that mean if that sunsets?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, right, it's going to be much harder to gather some of that intelligence and evidence, right, pursuant to a legitimate judicial warrant, right? And so it will impact the ability to gather evidence, right, and prosecute
whether it's a counterintelligence case or even a criminal case. Right?
You know, I think the challenge becomes is we separate these two as if criminals are bifurcated. I'm on the counterintelligence side, or here.
By definition, you're committing a crime if you're.
That's right, right, and it's really hard to bifurcate the two in today's day and age.
It just dawned on me that the clock's ticking there, and that will also impact not only where I look at it primarily from a national security perspective, but also very much from a fighting crime perspective.
Yeah, it absolutely will. The service does. We don't do many of those particular investigations. We partner with the FBI where those things occur, and so I would sort of defer and listen to where the FBI has taken a position. And I think
they've been pretty vocal.
They've been pretty vocal, right? And I think we'd be remiss to think that there's not going to be an impact.
So let's talk NCFI a little bit and supporting state, local, tribal, territorial. I mean, we're spending a lot of money on cyber security related issues and defending our critical infrastructure, and we need to. I'm the first to hit that button every time. We do need to spend more. But if when we look at it, not a ton of that money makes it down to the front lines of this battle at our state and local. How do you feel we ought to be thinking about this at a 30,000 foot kind of level?
Yeah, right? I mean, I think, right, the real challenge is how do you build the resiliency in private organizations who, at the end of the day, right, have to really look at what their bottom line is, right? And so at least the way the service is looking at it is one of the things that we can do, right, is going back to how we investigate crime, how we're embedded with state and locals, right, is building the capacity of the state and locals. Because again, your first call, if there's going to be a cyber incident, is going to be to your state and locals, right? If we can increase their capacity, it's really an economy of force.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a second piece to it that I think is also important, right, is I think you almost have to look at this going back to the model of sort of community-oriented policing, right? And so when crime was ravaging neighborhoods in the 80s, right, you come up with this community-oriented policing mindset and thesis, right? Part of that was basically saying is, okay, how do we change the environment? How do we make the environment so that it's not conducive to crime, right? And so the more people that we can get out in the state and locals that are focusing in on that prepare piece of it, right? Helping these helping these small businesses build their resiliency, right? Let's talk about one thing. You talk about most breaches right now, right? Like, is the threat of a breach to Citibank or some of the major financial institutions to their proper information network, is that really a huge concern? Or is the bigger concern from a third party that's hooked into their network that they don't have control over the information network, right?
Sure.
And so the question is how do we build the entire resiliency of the ecosystem? And I think it's leveraging, one area is state and locals, right, to focus both on the respond phase, but also the prepare, right? Really working within their communities to heighten the sense of awareness of some basic actions that they can take to increase the security of their information networks.
And that's a great set of points. And it also means you talk a lot, and we've had a number of discussions around collaboration, and it really does take a team effort to get our arms around this, and whether it's U.S. Secret Service and FBI and HSI and all the various alphabet soup of agencies there with state and local, but it's also other agencies and the private sector in particular. Because I mean, what makes, and you brought this up different ways, you don't necessarily know at the time of a breach what that intention is behind the adversary. So what could appear to be just another crime, and there's no such thing as just could actually have a national security implication, right?
Absolutely.
And that's how you were able to chase down some of the breadcrumbs on the 9/11 hijackers.
That's exactly right. Right. And I mean, I think if you go back to the 9/11 hijackers, right, and you look, you know, it's very easy today to look at some of the things that were missed. Right, and play Monday morning quarterback and say, well, we should have connected all of these dots, right? But when you're siloed and you're looking at things sort of in your own vacuum, you're going to miss things, right? And I think when you look at how the military today is configured to fight with a much more joint attitude, right? I think that can apply to law enforcement, because what I do believe is, right, in the United States, there are about 18,000 different police agencies that are out there, right? And so I remember some of our foreign partners trying to come in here and coordinate an investigation. You're like, well, no, you got to go coordinate with so-and-so. Well, hold on, you got to coordinate with so-and-so, right? I think it's really important today that we adopt much more of how the military is fighting its wars today to how we operate within the United States, was in a more of a joint task force that addresses, you know, both a preparation. So you bring in the agencies that are really focused on building resiliency. You bring in the agencies that are focused on sort of the response, right, the law enforcement agencies. And then the recover, you're bringing in the emergency management, you're bringing in those, so that when there is an incident, everybody has a cohesive plan that can operate, and we're pulling out a playbook, because clearly today, because of our dependence on information networks, right, it's going to be a target in whatever adversary we're facing, whether it be a criminal actor, whether it be Iran, whether nation states in today's environment, right? It's not as if we could say, hey, we're over here and we're going to be walled off and we can send our military someplace else to defend us. The next altercation will have some effect here as people start to leverage information networks.
And Mike, push back on this, but especially when it comes to the law enforcement community, like the military, we can't be exchanging business cards when the bomb goes off or the balloon goes up or whatever analogy. There's a lot of trust building that 100%. Has to be set up before. So even if that's the case, that gets to this need for collaboration. You and I have never had this discussion, but I'd be curious, do we need a Goldwater Nichols for law enforcement? Do you think we need to go that far?
Listen, I think it would be very interesting. I think it would be different than how it is applied
in the military,
within the military.
Because there's not the same career paths and everything else.
And even just from a comprehensive, like, it's a lot easier to take a Marine Corps military officer and implement him into a higher level command planning group than it is within law enforcement if you don't have some experiences in jurisdiction. But I would argue is that we should operate in a much more joint environment, and that we should be developing more of a strike force mentality for law enforcement, where the Department of Justice sort of leads a interagency task force, right, that leverages everybody's information to target some of these bad actors, right? And it's operational. One of the things that I'll say
that's a very forward-leaning approach, Mike. Yeah, I like that.
Listen, I mean, I think right now the FBI, the NCI, JTF, right? I think it's a great organization, but it's not operational. Right, and so information gets fed, information gets coordinated. You know, we have a lot of fusion centers here, but at the end of the day, what we really need is action.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. And I always looked at Jayadif South in Florida as a model that others could build on. The thing that you brought up that I think is very interesting, though, and this may be heresy to some of your colleagues, but should a Secret Service agent and officer spend time at the Bureau and CBP and ICE, and do we need to take that step?
I think it was, listen, I think to your point before, right, what that does build is trust.
And at least you know what the headaches are, right?
Listen, one of I think the great things about sort of the U.S. military is we sponsor all of these schools, and you have foreign military officers that come here, right? You're building relationships, right, that you can leverage at the time of it.
When you need them,
You absolutely do, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that a much more joint interoperability between agencies makes sense.
Hey, Mike, I hate to say it, but you got some homework as a senior fellow. This is a great topic to look at because, I mean, and also to ensure full confidence of the U.S. citizenry around law enforcement. I think that could go a long way to not suggesting but I feel like we do have to build some of that confidence back.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think the criminals have evolved, right, into operating in today's environment, right? I think law enforcement is, just because of the nature of things, we're still bringing the old paradigm back to business, right? And, you know, and every once in a while we get together and we operate in a joint environment, but it generally is for a limited time of action, case by basis, and by relationship. You know, I think a lot of the pieces of the puzzle are there. I don't think you need to create a lot of new things. I think it's a question of taking some of the pieces that are already on the chessboard and reorganizing them to operate in a much more efficient model.
And it, dare I say, takes some leadership as well. And one thing, not to pat you on the back while you're here, but when you were in your role at Secret Service, your colleagues at FBI loved you as much as your Secret Service colleagues did, and that's not always the case between two strong federal law enforcement agencies. But don't underestimate the role that a few good leaders can have on building some of that trust as well. Is that something? I mean, if you were to look back, you deserve to be proud of that. I hope you consider that one of those.
I appreciate that, and what I'd say is, right, I was very lucky because I was there at a time with a group of FBI
who also wanted to work
leaders,
together,
right,
Matt
who had a
Gore,
background from a military who operated in this environment before, right? And so we sort of evolved into working much more closely together in a joint environment that was
getting
that
stuff
served to be
done.
that served to be very, very productive for that period of time. The question really becomes is that's sort of episodic and relationship based. Yeah. We really need to develop a system, institutionalize it, and make it much more standard across the board. And what will happen is eventually it'll just become that's the way we do business, as opposed to based off of, hey, these two guys get along, we're going to bring it together.
So to go from individuals to institutions and personalities to processes,
that's right.
That easier said than done, and quite honestly, still need to be true to the mission that is unique.
That's correct.
To financial services, but I don't see a better way around. I mean, we're outgunned in this environment.
I think that's exactly right. As cybercrime continues, right, to sort of spiral out of control, whatever numbers that you want to look at as far as the losses in it, right, the capacity of law enforcement to operate as individual agencies against it, the odds are just against us.
This is another area, maybe I'm stepping in it because I've never had an unspoken thought, but no broken windows theory and countering crime. And you talked about community policing. And for transparency, Chief Bratton is a friend and a number of these folks who implemented some of these programs. Do we need a no broken windows sort of theory around cyber?
I think we do. I mean, right? You know, I think
because you never know if it's something bigger. Is the
and I also do think, right, when you look at sort of the Verizon data breach report, and you still read and you still look at some of the things that most attacks are still just stolen credentials, right? A lot of attacks are really unpatched vulnerabilities, closed remote desktop protocols, right? And so when you look at some of these things, a lot of it is listen, if you're a small business, right, do I have the talent that even understands my information network? I need my information network to operate, but I can't afford to really protect it, right? And so how am I doing that? And you know, you could lay out whatever legislation that you want. If my business can't afford it, it can't afford it.
Roger that. No, you're right. You're right. And I'm glad you brought up small and medium-sized businesses, because that is the underbelly. And that is where a lot of America's innovation is generated.
That's right.
So we've got to defend that. And the bottom line is the Fortune 500 are spending money. They are putting the resources into this. But small, medium-sized businesses, not so much. And it's understandable why.
Listen.
It's the bottom line.
We just had sort of the hack of the SEC Twitter account.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not the first time we've seen the SEC be sort of be hacked, right, in order to manipulate financial gain, right? And so you have an organization that clearly is well-resourced, right, and understands the threat of cyber investigations. These are complicated networks. There's no way that you're going to be able to defend them unless you have much more of a community-oriented policing look, and everybody understands that we're an ecosystem and that each one of our success depends on the other.
Yeah, no, I love that. I really do. So looking since I like to say since the end of the Cold War, threat forecasting has made astrology look respectable. So let's not talk specifically only about threat actors, but looking ahead, what do you think that the top things our legislative and executive branch and what should we be focused on in 2024?
Yeah. What I would say is really taking now the cybersecurity strategy, right, that
making
was put
it
out
real.
with a different pill and making
nouns
it real.
into verbs.
Exactly, right? Like, I think it's very important that we start looking at it and really starting to understand how we implement those things within our critical infrastructure, and let's define critical infrastructure pretty broadly, right? Our defense industrial base depends on many of the small and medium businesses.
And I got to put a footnote here. Space should be designated a critical infrastructure. I'll shut up now, but go ahead.
Listen, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's like cyber. It's its own domain, but it transcends everything we do.
And the attacks are going to be cyber-enabled attacks.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Because you're communicating through an information network from space down to the ground.
Yep.
And as we depend more and more on space infrastructure, it's going to be exactly the same. And I do think, right, what you're going to want to do with that is identify that early and build the safety and security into it from the beginning.
Bake it into the design as much as you can. Yeah.
Because it's going to be much harder. Listen, I do think we have a lot of the right things in place. I think focusing on the software bill of materials, right? I think the cyber incident reporting bill, right? Continuing to move that forward and understand it. I think we actually have enough things in the hopper from a legislative perspective, right? Now it's really going back and deciding how do we implement these things in a cohesive and integrated way.
Well said. Well said. Anything we didn't? So one issue that I'd be curious in terms of some of your thoughts on. So we talked a bit about North Korea, and obviously, if I were to rack and stack, China is probably the existential. Russia, very capable, and we see what's playing out globally. But what about Iran? And just given the terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas and the ongoing conflict, what do you think we need to be thinking about in the U.S. When it comes to Tehran?
Listen, what I think is this, right? We know that Iran, right, has a credible cyber threat.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
There
have been indictments years ago on U.S. dams and other.
That's correct. And just recently in Pennsylvania, they believe the IRGC, the water plant, right?
Yep.
And so I do think, right, one of the things that we have to look at is that time is running out, right? At this stage of the game, I'm not a high-level military official, but I don't know that anybody still can compete with the U.S. on a straight-on military battlefield, right? But clearly, people have been conducting their reconnaissance, right? They know of our dependence. One of our greatest vulnerabilities is, right, our dependence on information networks. And so it's great that we're that advanced in technology. The vulnerability is that we're dependent on information networks, right? And so
incredible information,
right? And so I do think we have to understand that if there are conflicts ahead, right, the U.S. homeland will most likely, it would be highly unlikely that somebody would not eventually utilize their cyber capabilities to impact us here back home. Because one, that threat in of itself is a deterrent to us potentially taking action there, right?
And think about it. I mean, you mentioned the water incident here. Israel had been getting pounded by Iran for years on the waterfront. And then the way I look at it, and this may be a little cheeky, but Ukraine was always Russia's practice field. South Korea, Japan was always North Korea's practice field. UAE, Saudi, and especially Israel was always in the crosshairs of Iran and its proxies. Everyone's China's practice field. But at the end of the day, these cases have implications because they're practice fields, and it's a movie coming to a theater near you one day, right? So that's why I think when it comes to international, it's not about just doing good for others, which is a strong humanitarian case, but it's in our best interest to be able to work with our allies overseas on all of these cases.
That's absolutely correct. Listen, what I will say is sort of we sit here is one of the most rewarding things that I found when I was the assistant director and working there was Europol.
Bingo.
Their EC3, right? if you go back to sort of their model where they're bringing in sort of the key members.
Were you there when Trolls or Stevie or
Stevie?
Yeah,
Stevie,
yeah, they
right?
do good work.
Right?
Yeah.
But they had this JCAT, this sort of joint task force between, some of the key foreign partners. The FBI was a huge player in that.
So was Secret
right?
Service.
The Secret Service, and again, we carried over working collaboratively from there. In here, HSI was there. Right? If we sort of take a look at that, right? I think it's really important because it's not just going to be a tax on us. It's really important that we sort of get this right. And the way we're the most successful is when we all work together.
And I just want to pull that thread one teeny bit further, because what I thought was fascinating about EC3 and Europol's mission is also working with the private sector.
100%.
A lot of these cases couldn't have gotten off the ground if Microsoft and all the other providers and vendors weren't supporting the mission.
That's correct.
Mike, what did we not touch on that we should have?
I don't know. I think we've come a pretty long way.
Well,
other
thanks.
than maybe how the New York Giants are going to do next year.
You know I'm an Aaron Rodgers guy, so I'm a Jets fan. So we had the best preseason in the history of football, and not necessarily the best season. So, although I'm a DeVito fan too, Mike, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your for being a senior fellow and continuing to fight the good fight. And let me leave you with a token of our appreciation. You're the first senior fellow to get one, figuratively and literally, our challenge coin, and it's made in the U.S. So, Mike, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good stuff.